heavy anchorage. Good afternoon, squawk 1550. Go ahead.
Do you have any traffic in front of us?
Japan 1628 heavy, negative.
左前方になんかこう明かりが2つですね。
In 1986, over Alaska, Japan Airlines encountered something truly inexplicable in the night sky.
These guys were flying from Paris to Tokyo. They noticed a very bright light, and it's following them.
Japan 1628 heavy, sir. If you're able to identify the type of aircraft, and see if you can tell whether it's military or civilian.
We cannot identify the type, but I think they're quite big.
The pilot, Kenju Tarachi, had described it as being several times larger than his airplane, and his airplane had an elevator in it.
It was huge. And Captain Tarachi was open about the fact that he was afraid during this event. But the Japanese airline incident was hardly unique.
We just had something go right over the top of us. It's a definite UFO or something like that.
Incidences like this were much more widespread than anybody realized.
I have no idea what that is. It just flew right over me. The length is unbelievable. Looks like a UFO.
UFOs definitely represented an aviation safety hazard. There were many cases documented that showed that. And yet, the government didn't seem to care.
In tonight's special report, Mary Murphy finds that while the U.S. government has closed its eyes on the matter, the public hasn't stopped seeing or believing.
The U.S. government closed its formal study of UFOs in late 1969.
The cases that required investigation, none of that went away. And so people stepped in to fill that void.
UFO reporting center.
We got a call. He saw 5 distinct lights in a triangular pattern.
Thankfully, these events were recorded by civilian researchers. It showed that the phenomenon was continuing and that it was extensive, that it was widespread.
I mean, look what these people are saying. Look what they've documented. This is real, and it's a safety hazard.
We get reports every night.
I don't know what the hell it is. It looks like a rotating light around it.
I'd like to report a UFO.
Ufology today is in the state, I would say, that, say, chemistry was when chemistry was alchemy. A mixture of superstition, wild ideas, unproved claims, and yet out of that whole mess, finally, the very first-class science of chemistry evolved. What we need in ufology is to make it professional.
J. Allen Hynek was a great advocate for civilians to be researching UFOs. He felt that the subject deserved scientific scrutiny.
Dr. Hynek's been studying UFOs for 30 years. His files contain unexplained sightings from 140 countries.
After Hynek died in 1986, his work was carried on by a handful of national UFO research groups. Even though the government wasn't paying attention, the civilians were.
Bill Ambrosio of Greenwich, Connecticut, has recorded more than 300 hours of conversations with people who've reported UFO sightings.
Larry Fawcett, a police officer in Coventry, Connecticut. He helped establish Citizens Against UFO Secrecy.
UFO reporting center.
I have never been a believer of UFOs in my entire life, and I just seen a minimum of 9 this morning with my own eyes, and I mean, I'm a believer.
My goal in writing about UFOs has been mainly to bring information forward to the public, but beyond that, it's to motivate the official world to pay attention. Once I realized that there was enough data to show that these things are real, and the possibility that there are other civilizations visiting us here, I was just hooked. And I realized that I needed information that could be verified and documented and cases that were irrefutable. I turned to the most credible civilian researchers because they were the ones doing the work. The National Aviation Reporting Center on Anomalous Phenomena, NARCAP, was founded by Dr. Richard Haynes, who is a former chief scientist for NASA. Hey, Dick, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Sure is good to see you. What is your reflection on, looking back at NARCAP, like why you started it?
Well, I'd spent quite a number of years as a hobby studying this phenomenon, and I finally came to the understanding that ufology, the study of UFOs or UAPs these days, is not going to progress until there's some practical benefit from it. And so I came up with this idea, let's look at aviation safety.
The FAA did not want to receive any reports from any of their personnel about UFO events. It was actually written in their manual that if anyone saw a UFO, they were to report it to a civilian group.
NARCAP is a reporting center for pilots and air traffic controllers who would like to make a report of their sightings in a completely confidential manner. We are looking carefully at events that are happening in our skies all the time where flight safety could be impacted. Our objective is to make flying safer.
The work I did with NARCAP and really getting familiar with the aviation safety hazards, I became more focused on that as an important component of this whole issue. The second story that I ever published on UFOs in 2001 was based on a 100-page report that NARCAP produced. There were cases where the pilot would have to make a very fast turn or he'd have to dive to avoid hitting a UFO. Cases where passengers were actually injured by maneuvers the airplane had to make. If you have commercial pilots that are somehow in danger, I just thought as a journalist, this is really important. I mean, how could the aviation world ignore this? One of the most fascinating cases in the report was the Japan Airlines case, 1986.
Japan 1628, have a register. I'm picking up a hit on the radar, approximately 5 miles in trail, your 6 o'clock position.
What was really compelling about this case is that you have the radar data, and then you got the testimony of the pilot talking to ground control.
Do you still have visual contact?
Oh, same position.
There are these amazing tapes in Richard Haynes' archive of calls he made, and the pilots will give him detailed accounts of what they saw. One of the recordings was with Captain Tarachi from the Japan Airlines case.
How long did it take to move from the 12 o'clock position?
ものすごい早いですね。そこを私ずーっと見てましたので、追求はできませんでした。それでなんかわかんないけどもずっとついてくるという。
As they're approaching Anchorage, they again radio the FAA, and they have the plane do a couple of turns to see if the object continues to follow it.
Similar request, you're making a right turn 360 degrees, 360-degree turn, and advise me what your traffic does then.
Captain Tarucci was very surprised to realize that the object was still beside him throughout that turn. How is it able to do that? Why would it do that?
The phenomenon acts with what I would call curiosity. To me, that's intelligence.
It raises some fundamental questions about the nature of the phenomenon. Would it constitute a threat to flight safety? And the answer is clearly yes.
The Japan Airlines event was fairly lengthy as UFO sightings go.
They watched it for perhaps a half hour or more. It moved in different positions around the aircraft. Eventually, as they descended and approached the airport, it disappeared.
But the real import of the case is what happens after the sighting.
Captain Tarachi spoke to the American press about this event, and Japan Airlines took him off the job for like a year. It just shows that professional pilots cannot report an actual event that happened that might even be a hazard to their aircraft without facing repercussions.
Now on the phone with us from Anchorage is Paul Stuckey, who's public affairs officer for the FAA in the Alaska region. What, Paul, does the FAA say this is?
Well, we've got some possible evidence of confirmation, but it is not real strong. And the military is totally unable to confirm whether this object was real by its radar.
and neither are we, actually.
Publicly, the FAA said that the object on radar was an unexplained split image of the Japanese 747 and not a separate object. But there was more going on with this case than what the FAA had to say publicly. When John Callahan, who was the head of accidents and investigations at FAA, first heard about this event, he ordered that all the data be sent to him immediately on this case.
I said to the software people, I want a briefing in the next room. I want to see on a chart every place where the Japanese guy was, and I want to see all the targets around him. I watched on radar. I took a videotape of it, and the next day came back to Washington headquarters. This is where it first starts. It starts at 19 after the hour. You see that little dot? That's the UFO.
He studied all this data, and then, according to Callahan, he was called to a meeting at the Washington headquarters. That meeting involved a team of representatives from the White House. It included CIA representatives.
That's strange. These things are not typically investigated by the FBI, not the CIA.
I play the tapes for them. I show them all the paperwork we got. I give them the whole tale, and they were all excited about it. So I'm standing next to this little guy, and he says, okay, we were never here. We're confiscating all this data, and you're all sworn to secrecy. So I said, what do you think it is? I'm still thinking it's the stealth bomber. He says, well, it's a UFO.
So the U.S. government doesn't take UFOs seriously, and yet they do this? So what's going on here? Well, of course, we don't know, because it disappeared into the black maw of the government.
My story about pilot encounters with UFOs got a lot of play, and it was picked up all across the country, but the culture as a whole didn't really take UFOs seriously. It was still considered fringe. And I felt kind of determined to fight that.
Have you ever wondered why there wasn't more coverage in the mainstream media about the subject of UFOs? We are very pleased today to have an investigative journalist who has pushed through that barrier, Leslie Kean. Thank you so much for joining us.
When I started out reporting on UFOs, I felt like I was risking my career as a journalist. I did feel that way. I was sort of an anomaly. There was nobody doing this in the mainstream. I was really nervous about being ridiculed because the attitudes of people were mainly that it was a joke. If I would go to a party and people said, what do you do? I would have to say, well, I'm a journalist. And then the next question was always, well, what do you write about? And I was dreading that question. I did not want to have to say what I wrote about. It was embarrassing. But the fact that there was so much opposition to it, the fact that it was ridiculed, actually kind of fueled my fire. And I felt so clear that there was something to it that I just was willing to take that risk. And then I realized that there were others who are out there researching this, taking it out of the fringe, who took it upon themselves to do what the government wasn't doing, which was to investigate cases.
Your new documentary, James, I Know What I Saw, assembles accounts from various UFO witnesses from around the world. What do you believe, James?
I believe that there are structured craft of unknown origin whizzing around in our airspace whose flight characteristics are so beyond anything we've had.
My name is James Fox. I have been working on UFO films for coming up on my third decade. I was never out to prove that ET has landed. My primary objective is to say there is some really compelling evidence that needs further investigation. I stuck with it despite the level of ridicule for decades because I had gone to locations, I'd met with the witnesses, I'd looked up the documents from government files because I wanted to create a body of evidence that I could present to mainstream and say, look, there's something to it.
Over the years, James Fox and I had a kind of cooperative relationship, and we shared a frustration about the lack of government investigation, the lack of transparency, this sort of blasé attitude that it didn't matter. James had experienced this frustration for a long time in so many cases that he investigated. One of them being the Phoenix Lights of 1997.
We're visiting with James Fox, filmmaker in town, doing research on the UFOs and interviews.
What makes the Phoenix Lights UFO case so compelling is the sheer volume of eyewitness testimony.
Hundreds of witnesses saw something gliding over the state of Arizona for over an hour and a half.
It was Thursday night, March 13th, 1997.
Nice, calm evening, about 8:30.
My daughter, Monica, came running in the house and said, "You've got to come outside."
As I closed both windows and I looked to the north, I saw a large black craft coming right towards us. And I told my wife at that time, I said, that son of a bitch is a mile long.
I was working on a film at the time on UFOs, and so I saw the progression of this whole story unfold.
It barely missed that mountain.
Really?
Yeah, came floating over the mountain.
The witnesses described this boomerang-shaped object that was over a mile across from wingtip to wingtip.
It's coming across the sky, and as it's moving, it's blocking and unblocking the stars. There is actually a shape.
We were just in awe of it. I mean, no fear or anything, just kind of like, oh, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen.
I thought I was going to pass out because I stopped breathing. I was so enthralled in looking at this thing.
The Phoenix Lights event in March is being talked about now all over the world.
The buzz is very big in the desert Southwest after some weird happenings in the skies over Phoenix recently.
The objects in the sky over Arizona were probably seen by more witnesses than any other single UFO event in American history.
So many people wanted answers that the governor had to respond.
The governor had said he was going to provide answers for people. They built up this hope and expectation. There's been an investigation and we're going to get something here.
I believe it a serious offense for anyone, human, space alien, or otherwise, to engage in mysterious activity in our nighttime skies. That is why I will personally ask that the perpetrator be prosecuted to the fullest for the havoc wrought on our entire community. Don't get him too close to me, please. It's, you know. Now, this just goes to show that you guys are entirely too serious.
He had one of his aides dressed up in an alien suit, and he made a mockery of the whole thing. And I was in touch with the witnesses, and they were just furious.
Thank you. Thank you.
That case is, I think, pretty much representative of how the U.S. government treats the phenomenon.
Even this mass sighting, which involved hundreds of witnesses and lots of concern in the state of Arizona, even that was not enough to get government involvement and to get government accountability. The lack of transparency within the American government on this topic was so frustrating. But James and I have both discovered that there are other countries that really take this seriously.
As a filmmaker, I was able to have a level of participation from foreign governments and military personnel that I didn't see in the United States.
James and I went to France together to the headquarters of the French agency that studies UFOs, situated within the equivalent of NASA in France, in the Space Studies Center. France sees it as a scientific problem. They had access to specialists from all over the country who would contribute to investigations. So if they needed a weather specialist or a soil expert, psychologists who would interview the witnesses, all these different areas of expertise that all have a role to play in an investigation.
I meet with military people in China and in Russia and in Africa and Australia and South America. There were similar things happening all around the world. There was a very compelling incident that happened in Tehran, Iran in 1976 that involved a pilot trying to shoot down a UFO. The pilot's name was Parviz Jafari, and he described this whole cat and mouse thing with this object. He said it could literally go from this point in the sky to this point in the sky in the blink of an eye, and he said that was miles.
I was looking here at about 70 miles out, and he jumps all of a sudden 10 degrees to my right. I was wondering, what is it?
At one point, I think he felt threatened and decided to shoot it. That turned out to be not such a good idea. His whole control panel froze up. He was thinking he might have to eject from the airplane.
When that thing went away, our radio became operative again.
Jafari made a very important contribution by speaking out about this. And in Iran, none of it was kept secret. It was a big event in that country. Countries in South America also took reports from pilots a lot more seriously. The government of Chile sees it as mainly an aviation issue.
De que la gente está tomando conciencia de que existe un cierto fenómeno que debe ser analizado desde un punto de vista multidisciplinario.
Costa Rica also does not keep things secret. They had what I think may be the best photograph of a UFO ever released that was taken by a government mapping plane. That photograph was made public. It was studied by scientists. We don't know what our government actually possesses in terms of photographs or videos because they've been kept classified. In America, UFOs became really prevalent during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, we did not want to disclose anything. So that's sort of when we got in the groove of keeping it secret. It just sort of became ingrained in our system to see this as a national security issue, which therefore needs to be classified. Some of these other governments, they look at it as an aviation safety problem, perhaps, or a scientific problem. To me, this is the way things should be done. After returning from these explorations of other countries, I brought that information to a very important government insider who I had met in 2001, who was all about government transparency. John Podesta was President Clinton's chief of staff, and under Clinton, he was partly responsible for the release of many, many documents through the Freedom of Information Act.
It's been really great. I appreciate your support.
I came into this really as an advocate of open government, more than I had thought a lot about UFOs or UAPs. They were a curiosity for me, really, but the two interests kind of married in 2001 when I met Leslie Kean.
I think it's time to open the books on the question of government investigations of UFOs. It's time to find out what the truth really is that's out there.
I think there has been fear that if the government ever tipped their hand to say, well, we have some phenomena and we don't know what it is, the public would just freak out. And I think quite the contrary. I think the public can handle the truth.
I wonder if you'd like to see a photograph.
I would go to these countries and then I put together information about how these agencies worked into a dossier, and I gave it to John Podesta.
You know, until the United States government joins and has their own official agency, like the French, like the British, like the people in Chile, the people in Peru, it kind of holds back the whole world.
In that dossier were 2 letters to John Podesta, specifically to him, one written by the head of the Chilean government agency studying UFOs, and one written by the head of the French agency, explaining why they felt it was absolutely crucial that the United States be involved if we're going to make any progress with this.
I think it's important for investigative journalists like Leslie Kean to keep pressing for answers. So I put my credibility on the line, and I supported her efforts to open the space for politicians to say it may be a question of national security. It is a question of aviation safety.
It seemed like what we really needed was some kind of major UFO event, a major case with lots of data, with great witnesses, that would galvanize the country, that would be in the media, and that would force government involvement.
Tower, this is Dan. Hey, Dave, it's Sue from United Tower. Hey, did you see a flying disc out by C-17?
November 7th, 2006. Something happened over O'Hare Airport. An event that, once again, suggests a problem with aviation safety, this time over one of the country's busiest airports.
You had workers on the tarmac and the pilots. And these guys look up at around 1,000 feet. They see a disc-shaped object above them.
Some of our pilots on the ground were reporting a UFO sighting at 1,000 feet.
You don't believe this was possibly your imagination?
It was definitely not my imagination.
Joe was a mechanic for United Airlines. While taxiing a jumbo jet to the hangar, he and another mechanic
noticed an object up in the sky sitting above the terminal complex.
It had a metallic grayish appearance to it. It appeared to be 30 to 40 feet in diameter. It's not moving at all. I mean, there's no motion. And this goes on for a few minutes until suddenly the object just goes straight up. And in doing so, burns a hole through the clouds.
Dude, there was a disc out there flying around. There was a what? A disc. A disc? Like a frisbee? Like a UFO type thing.
My name is John Hilkovich. I was transportation reporter at Chicago Tribune for roughly 18 years. A few days after the alleged sighting, I got a phone call from an official with the National UFO Reporting Center. I think he assumed that I had heard about this, and he wanted to know, was I working on a story? I covered transportation. UFO was not part of the beat at all. So, I had my healthy reporter's skepticism about this, but this is highly restricted airspace. You don't want something up there that doesn't belong there. So I took that information and contacted the FAA and United Airlines, and they both denied any knowledge of this alleged sighting. They were sort of amused by it, like, are you okay, John? You're asking these weird questions. I spent the next couple of weeks interviewing as many people as I could about this sighting. These were all trained aviation professionals, pilots who were taxiing on the ground, ramp workers who were pushing back planes. Given the pushback from the FAA, I submitted a FOIA request for the logs at O'Hare Tower for that day, November 7th.
Somebody reported a UFO or a flying disc above Charlie Concourse, seriously. Excellent. Yeah.
We saw it a half hour ago. A whole bunch of us over at the Charlie Concourse.
Really?
When I heard the recordings, it was clear that this alleged sighting was logged in O'Hare Tower. The United Airlines was told about this by numerous employees. There was just an abundance of radio chatter between O'Hare Tower and various people on the airfield.
You're seeing flying discs. Well, that's what the pilot and the ramp guys are telling us. The C-17, they saw some flying disc above, and we can't see above us. You didn't see it, right?
I imagine hitting so. And if I did, I wouldn't admit to it.
United, despite their insistence to me that they had no knowledge of this and they took no action, was first to backtrack to say that, yes, it had received reports of this. And then the FAA said that upon further review, yes, they had received calls saying that something was up there.
Is it standard that the FAA, if you ask them a straightforward question, would lie, essentially?
Well, I mean, there's nothing standard about this story. This story ran on page 1 of the Chicago Tribune on January 1st, 2007, and the reaction to it was unbelievable.
John, the response has been, well, out of this world, hasn't it?
I mean, just the last 2 days, this is my email.
Several pilots, apparently, to Chicago's O'Hare swear they saw one, a UFO.
It looked like literally someone had poked a hole in the clouds.
It got more hits on the Chicago Tribune website than any story they had ever written in the past. But there was still a very strong taboo against this, so there were some skeptics that were called on these various shows who kind of debunked it.
We turn to the chief astronomer for the Franklin Institute, Derek Pitts. Derek, thanks for being with us again.
My pleasure, Keith.
All right, let's start with the UFO sighting at O'Hare. When it's pilots saying this, do we have to listen? And then what is it they could have seen but not been able to identify?
Well, that's a really difficult question to answer because there are all kinds of sky phenomena that could have manifested themselves, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are alien spacecraft.
I was intrigued that so many people had seen this. But we can't just suggest, here's a spacecraft from another planet that defies the laws of physics. So for me, I go to those things that seem much more likely, much more reasonable, much more possible.
When I read the Chicago Tribune story, I was really shocked by the FAA efforts to try and explain this away. First of all, they said it was airport lights reflecting off the clouds. And it turned out that the airport lights had not even been turned on yet when the event occurred. So that explanation didn't work.
The FAA adds that a sighting might have been caused by a weather phenomenon.
The next explanation they provided was that it was a weather phenomenon. I knew what that probably meant was this phenomenon called a hole punch cloud. It's very rare where ice crystals fall from one cloud above to a lower cloud and they melt a hole in a cloud. I called a bunch of cloud experts, asked what the conditions were that would be required for a hole punch cloud to form. I learned that the temperature would have to be below freezing, which it was not at that day at O'Hare. It was around 50 degrees. So I was able to completely dispatch the FAA's explanation of a weather phenomenon. For the FAA and the government, it's just come up with something to make it go away, no matter how ludicrous it is, no matter how inaccurate it is. This was an aviation safety hazard. This thing was floating over an airport. It made me feel inspired to really want to do more, because this just can't keep going like this.
In 2006, we had that very compelling case that happened at O'Hare Airport. That got a lot of media coverage. We were coming up on the 10-year anniversary for the Phoenix Lights case. That was getting a lot of coverage, and there seemed to be a whole new wave of interest in the media on the phenomenon. And I decided to kind of strike while the iron's hot. Ever since the Phoenix Lights case, I was meeting with the witnesses, and I heard their frustration with how the governor treated their testimony by making a mockery and ridiculing. So in 2006, I managed to get a hold of Fife Symington, who was no longer governor of Arizona. He responded immediately and accepted my invitation for an interview. And it ended up being one of those aha moments for me as a reporter.
If you had to do it over again, would you have done it any differently?
I think it was a legitimate occurrence of unknown origin, probably one of the major sightings in modern history in the country, because a lot of people saw it in Maricopa County, and I saw it too. So
And I saw it too. Did I just hear that straight? Did the former governor of Arizona, who made fun of one of the most significant modern-day mass sightings, just admit that he too was a witness?
at least I have the opportunity now to correct the record, and that's important.
I knew I had captured lightning in a bottle. I really knew this was going to be big. So I reached out to Leslie Kean, who I said, hey, you're not going to believe this.
I could not believe it. And my immediate response was, I want to break this story.
Leslie helped get that story out, and we got a lot of news coverage.
If you had been here 10 years ago and standing out here and looking up there at the lights and the view, you would have been astounded. You would have been amazed. And I suspect that unless the Defense Department proves us otherwise, that it was probably some form of an alien spacecraft.
There was momentum that started to build, and it was sort of a catalyst for us to feel, look at what's going on. Let's do something really big that will draw attention to this. I joined forces with James Fox, and we decided to bring together a panel of the very most credible witnesses from all over the world to a major event in Washington, which would draw a new level of attention to incidences like the O'Hare event.
We had scientists, generals, pilots, both military and civilian, from multiple countries.
Among them was Parviz Jafari, the Iranian pilot who had tried to shoot down a UFO, John Callahan from the Japan Airlines case.
And the moderator of the event was former governor of Arizona, Fife Symington.
He recognized that if there had been an agency in place when this event happened in 1997, everything would have been different.
Leslie and I wanted to see if we could set up a new government agency, a modern-day Project Blue Book.
Well, I'd like to welcome you all here today, and I don't think there's ever been a more high-level or distinguished group.
This event was the culmination of all the work I had done previously to bring everybody together in one room like that.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Jean-Charles Duboc. I am a retired Air Force captain.
Soy el capitán.
I am Rodrigo Bravo, captain and pilot of the Chilean Army.
What I'm about to tell you is about an event that never happened.
The power of this was that you had all these people in one room telling their stories one after the other.
Buenos días, damas y caballeros.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Oscar Santamaria Huertas, official pilot of the Peruvian Air Force, currently retired.
Oscar Santamaria encountered a UFO over an airbase in Peru, and he was instructed to go up and shoot it down.
My unit commander ordered me to take off in my Sukhoi 22 jet to shoot down the spherical object.
He said he unleashed all of his firepower, direct target hit, and it just absorbed his bullets.
The cone-shaped wall of fire that I sent out will normally obliterate anything in its path.
We also had Parviz Jafari, who talked about what happened to him.
I tried to launch a heat-seeker missile to it, but my missile panel went out.
The momentum just kept building and building and building.
Hundreds of people saw a majestic triangular craft.
I have no idea what we saw that night, but I do know with great certainty it was under intelligent control.
There's something very pragmatic about pilots, particularly military pilots. When you hear enough of those cases from around the world, I felt like the government had to pay attention.
We want the United States government to stop perpetuating the myth that all UFOs can be explained away in down-to-earth and conventional terms. Instead, our country needs to reopen its official investigation that it shut down in 1969.
We made the appeal at that press conference for a government agency to be set up.
Do I look all right? Because my wife will yell at me if I don't.
When it comes to events of this nature, dealing with the great unknown, we deserve, I believe, more openness and a serious pursuit of the facts by our government. Thank you very much.
That press conference was a moment for all of us. All of us had been in the trenches for all those decades. It was a very satisfying moment. And we got some very mainstream coverage.
A group gathering here in Washington to talk about their UFO sightings, but this apparently is no crackpot convention. Former high-level government and military officials are among those sharing what they've seen in the skies.
The press conference felt like a moment of huge success. But I had this fantasy, well, maybe this will lead to some kind of hearings on this. Nothing. Nobody in the government batted an eyelash. It didn't accomplish what we had hoped for, which was to get our government engaging with it. I thought that the 5-minute presentations that these witnesses made simply weren't long enough to really get across what happened to them. So I was inspired to bring these people into a book. And they reported on their cases in their own words. They wrote their own chapters. I don't think people at that level had ever come together under one umbrella before, and it had a lot of authority to it, not because of me, but because of the people I brought to the book. When it became a New York Times bestseller, I think it brought heightened credibility to the topic.
Our next guest calling for a formal investigation of unidentified flying objects, Leslie Kean.
I'm here to talk about UFOs, Leslie Kean.
Please welcome Leslie Kean. Real generals or like
Captain
Crunch? Like real
generals?
What generals think that there are aliens out there?
They don't think they're aliens, and that's one of the points they all make in this book, is we don't know what they are.
All right. Thank you so much, Leslie Kean.
When I first read Leslie Kean's book, I thought her investigation of this was exactly the kind of real science investigation that we should be thinking about starting around unidentified flying objects. In fact, I had Leslie as a guest here at the Franklin Institute to give a presentation about her book. We're about real science. We are not about speculation. And I felt that the work that Leslie demonstrated in her book was a responsible way to go about this.
I wrote the foreword to her book, which at the time people thought was just something to go on the shelf with the other ufologies, but was really, I think, a serious effort to try to document what pilots had seen, what other military senior leaders had documented.
The success of the book brought so much credibility to this topic, and it drew people into my life that hadn't been there before. Insiders who have been involved with this thing for a long time, some of them with security clearances, and they trusted me. That's what led to my being invited to a meeting years later where I was handed the biggest scoop of my career.
Leslie Kean, one of the investigative reporters who broke this story. This report is stunning.
The New York Times breaking the news that the Pentagon has been secretly researching the possible existence of UFOs. Apparently, the Department of Defense launched the program in 2007.
2007, the same year that we gave our press conference, it just so happened that this government program was already being set up. We didn't know about that at the time, of course, but it was actually happening.
The article was a huge moment, a moment I'll never forget. I had friends and family from all around the world going, oh my God, maybe you were right. Maybe you're not as crazy as I thought you were, you know? It was a good feeling. I was really proud of Leslie because the rest of the world was paying attention that maybe there is really something going on here.
That article was really just the beginning. It opened the door to all these questions that arose after that about what this program actually had learned about UFOs. Is it going to release information to the public? All these questions that people want to know about UFOs. Well, if there's a program, what do they know? Imagine just how wonderful it would be to have those questions asked on behalf of the American people.
Today, we will bring that organization out of the shadows. I think for far too long, people have said, oh, the public isn't ready to know about these things. But I think that the public is ready, now more than ever.
We were seeing things off the coast every day.
The pilots know what they are seeing. They are not crazy.
You just have to realize that it's using a kind of technology that we don't understand.
One of these objects happened to be from another civilization. That would change the future of humanity.